This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living, or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Hello and welcome to Ecoholics Thinking Tree series. Our guest for today needs no introduction. Though he owns a CV that would require an entire episode to address, currently he is the CV Star Professor of Economics at the Department of Finance, New York University Stern School of Business. He served as the Deputy Governor of Reserve Bank of India during 2017 to 2019. He is also a founding member of Pratham UK, the UK chapter of Pratham, an Indian NGO providing pre-primary and primary education to unprivileged and underprivileged children in India. His forthcoming book, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India, talks about the causes, consequences, and remedies of the increasing dominance of financial sector and central banking outcomes by India's growing fiscal deficit. In conversation with Dr. Viral Acharya. Welcome, sir. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Sanat. It's my pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I'm delighted and happy to discuss about the book. It's already released on 24th of July, and I'm happy to share some of the insights that I'm trying to provide in the book.
To begin with, sir, as we know that this pandemic is not something that any country's central bank could have prepared itself for. How do you see the decisions made by Reserve Bank of India in the light of COVID-19?
You're absolutely right, Sanat. This is something that not just the central bank, even the government authorities could not have prepared for. It's a very large, unprecedented shock. Nevertheless, something to keep in mind is that countries that had better initial conditions, in the sense of having more policy buffers to respond, be it on the fiscal side, be it on the financial side, of course, have greater capacity to accommodate such a shock. Typically, when the shock is so aggregate, and it's likely to have both supply side shock because of the lockdown, but there will also be a demand side shock because the discretionary spending is also likely to come down. And these shocks would require both fiscal and monetary accommodation, as the International Monetary Fund and the other multilateral agencies have been pushing. I think overall, given our initial conditions and in spite of all the challenges, the government and the central bank have adopted a slew of different measures. By and large, emerging markets have not been able to provide as large a fiscal relief as the developed economies have been able to. This is for two reasons. One, the developed markets are the so-called safe havens. There is greater credibility and commitment on repayment of cash flows, preservation of currency values, in the sense that currency won't lose value because of runaway inflation, etc. So, in spite of the nature of the shock, typically the safe haven borrowing costs come down very significantly in international markets. This is, of course, not always so for emerging markets. They are not safe havens. Their both ability and willingness to repay debts doesn't have as much commitment as the developed countries do. So that, of course, limits the policy space to start with. So if you see, developed economy expenditures have often been in the range of 10 to 15% of GDP, whereas many emerging market economy responses are below that, and in some cases even less than 5% of GDP. Second point here is that where the fiscal capacity is not adequately present, and certainly sovereigns have been concerned about their ratings assessment. And that is really just a concern about debt sustainability concerns in the minds of investors and markets. So where that capacity is not very high, and certainly this has been a consideration in case of India as well, effectively the packages have been designed to be more off balance sheet, which means either through provision of credit, maybe at easier terms, or through central bank accommodation through monetary easing, either through cutting of rates or pumping of excessive liquidity. And given these 2 points, you can anticipate and understand why India's package is also more loaded on the second side, which is it's more loaded on relief being provided through the banking system as well as through the central bank ammunition. Now, of course, in case of India, there are other aspects to the COVID shock. We had the migrant crisis. We have the rural India, where sometimes the delivery is not always as effective of various services. The government seems to have done a good job both in undertaking, I would say, certain critical agri reforms and providing food security given the vast storage of food grains that it had over this period. I think the question that is going to be a challenge in the coming days is that unfortunately our health curve has not looked great. The infections are continuing to rise. We are now seeing more than 50,000 to 60,000 new cases per day. Fatalities are rising in the range of 800 to 900 per day right now. And in terms of percentage growth from the total number of cases already, India is actually right now the fastest growing case count. This is going to mean that it may be hard for economic recovery to get off on a sound footing. Because as you will see from perhaps just around you, that because of the risk of infection, because of the concern that you may not have enough hospital care, healthcare infra available if numbers rise, people are gradually cutting back behaviorally on their own discretionary expenditures. They are just doing what may be the bare minimum. And that makes it hard to create jobs for others. It also makes it hard to get a sound economic footing. And the question everyone is asking is, given the state of the infection curve, will there be a need for more direct fiscal transfers, either as sort of direct transfers to individuals? Will certain most affected sectors require some kind of direct government support? And we can chat more about this, but the key question is, how does one create space for this kind of support? In the context of the book, what I would like to highlight is that some of the recent measures undertaken by the Reserve Bank of India to provide restructuring relief to certain sectors, I would have preferred them to work through the insolvency and bankruptcy code, perhaps allowing the promoters to retain control of their enterprises for a change, maybe for the post-COVID bankruptcies. And importantly, I would have liked the banking system to be asked to shore up its equity capital base so that it has the capacity to absorb losses and yet maintain intermediation at healthy levels. I would in fact recommend this also for the non-bank finance sector. Yes. So my sense is the fiscal and the financial stability angles need to be given equal and important focus as we deal with the immediate needs of the COVID, post-COVID recovery or amidst COVID recovery. As I said, the book has some suggestions on how to go about doing that.
Yes, true. There's a very thin line between better management and abuse of discretionary power when it comes to autonomy. There also have been many debates in the recent past concerning the erosion of RBI's autonomy. What are your views on this? What are the steps needed for a better future?
Yeah, I would say essentially what I have highlighted in the book and in my A.D. Shroff Memorial Lecture of 26th October 2018 is that essentially the problem with discretion arises when the discretion is primarily being used in short-run interests. And sometimes political horizons, because of the electoral cycles, can get woefully short. The focus may just be on the next 3 months, 6 months at best. Whereas a central bank, by very nature, has a very long-term mandate for protection of depositor interests, maintaining price stability or inflation stability, and safeguarding the external sector of the economy. So I would say there is, in general, a central bank leans against the pressures, the winds of such pressures, by adopting rules as much as possible, because that you're sort of tying yourself to the mast, as in the Odysseus analogy, so that you don't have to give in to the calls of the sirens every time they come about. But of course, macroeconomic conditions may themselves warrant some exceptional responses, some flexibility, some discretionary responses. I think the key is to ensure that they are not at the cost of sacrificing the long-term goals entirely. So sometimes you can push too far, that can risk financial stability. So for example, if you get banks to lend very aggressively over a very short period of time, usually the underwriting standards get very heavily eroded. So this is something we witnessed in the last decade, and we are still trying to clean up the mess of that. We also have to factor in that when government deficits and debt programs become very large, the central bank simply can't go ahead and monetize it all. It also needs to have a path to actually keep inflation in check, normalize this liquidity supply, because otherwise you could have runaway inflation, and that could reduce credibility on the external side as well. So I would say that the key issue is that the central bank should have enough autonomy to say no. It should have enough discipline to explain via reports when it takes extraordinary actions, why the discretion was exercised, what are its intended and unintended consequences, and what is the sunset clause. Because very often what happens is that the extraordinary measures become ordinary down the line, which is you get caught in a trap. It becomes a cul-de-sac, it's a dead end sometimes, because the more you keep doing and the more it doesn't work, the more you want to double down and prove that it's going to eventually work. And then it becomes an unfortunate trap or capture of the past decisions that the central bank has. So I think that's the fundamental trade-off, and that's why I have been always pushing for the autonomy of the central bank, both in the letter of the law as well as in spirit.
In spirit, yes. A quick question, sir. Like Monetary Policy Committee came into the picture in 2016. Do we consider as a step towards autonomy?
Absolutely, because it is an institution. It's an institutional framework. The committee is mandated by law to target a specific level of consumer price inflation. There is a band on which deviations are allowed, and that's to accommodate the concerns of growth, as also the mandate says that you have to maintain this target of inflation while paying attention to growth. If the mandate is violated for 3 quarters in a row, so inflation is outside the band, a testimony has to be provided. And importantly, there are embargo periods before and after the decision, where the members are not supposed to speak even to the government of India. And I think the mandate gives a very clear way of saying no, saying that, listen, my legal mandate is to maintain a 4% inflation. I cannot just push it on the side and accommodate the short-term pressures that you have. In fact, pressures were applied, meetings were sought, and the structure of the MPC framework was used actually to not attend these meetings and to keep the committee relatively at arm's length. So I think it is a very important step forward. What I'm trying to explain in the book is that nevertheless, the pressures of fiscal dominance, the fact that the government debt and borrowing programs are so large that they start pushing pressure on other aspects of central banking, such as regulatory policy, so in terms of giving capital relief to banks, getting them to lend aggressively and to specific parts of the economy, using an excessively surplus liquidity conditions to reduce government costs of borrowing, that there are many other aspects through which the central bank policies come under pressure. This is a very generalized form of fiscal dominance. It goes beyond the monetary policy, and we need to think hard about what is the institutional framework. Just the way we have the MPC framework for inflation targeting, can we design institutional frameworks for other decisions of the central bank so that these pressures of fiscal dominance can be mitigated and the central bank remains free to pursue its long-term interests rather than giving it to short-term electoral pressures?
True. Because there's monetary policy framework agreement as well as three independent members from the government side. Yes, sir. I was reading.
Absolutely. And just if I could add one point, every member has to explain through minutes why they voted the way they do. So this puts tremendous pressure and transparency on the system because the members they are going to be, what they have to say will be read, scrutinized, analyzed, discussed, debated. And maybe criticized, and so that's tremendous discipline and transparency, I would say, and this is a very beneficial aspect of the framework.
Moving on, sir, I was reading your book, and you were beautifully optimistic when you said that no matter how deep in trouble our economy is, with some changes backed by the ambitious Indian youth, everything can be brought on track. Having said that, there seems to be an underlying expectation of the people in the form of a major reform. Is our existing framework sufficient, or do we need a major upgrade to fight off this pandemic and build a better banking system for the future?
That's a great question, Sanat. I would say not just for the banking system. I think we also need significant reforms on the fiscal management of the economy. I think certainly we need to adhere to the FRBM targets in medium term. I explained why we need an independent bipartisan fiscal council that would both assess government's progress on the adherence and hold a mirror to the budgeting process. We need to reprioritize expenditures, spend more perhaps on direct benefit transfers and on infrastructure, health and education, and perhaps much less on other kinds of subsidies which don't seem to be as effective in generating long-run growth. We need to create tremendous transparency. We need to take stock on where we are on the fiscal side. What is the total public sector borrowing requirement? Because only then we will know how much of a course correction we need to undertake over the medium term. And finally, we need very serious divestments so that the government is using equity sales rather than borrowing in order to fund its necessary expenditures for the COVID relief and repair packages. On the financial stability side, also, I give many suggestions. I would say if I had to pick one, to me, the foremost is that we need ownership neutral regulation of the banking system. Right now, our public sector banks, public sector owned non-bank finance companies, certain acts such as the Banking Nationalization Act, they override the powers of the central bank in what it can do to deal with problem banks. Their management has failed, underwriting standards have been poor, equity capital is low. Right now, the central bank is not able to impose the same restrictions or replacement of management or injection of new equity capital by selling the equity to new owners as it can for private banks. It's not able to do that for public sector banks. And I think this is a very important legislative change that is required. Of course, another option that would solve this problem partly if the government was to simply reprivatize many of these entities, because then the government stakes would be gone and the Banking Nationalization Acts would not be as relevant anymore. At a minimum, though, the government can divest away from majority stakes. I think this would reduce the fiscal burden, but simultaneously they may produce improvements in public sector banks because new owners might bring in better management practices, more incentive-based compensation, so being able to attract better human capital, better risk management practices, better technology, digitization, fintech, and so on.
Yes.
The last point I would make, Sanat, is that reforms are at present required not just on fiscal and financial stability side, but I believe we might be in need of some serious structural transformational reforms on land, labor, ease of doing business, so that the global supply chains, which seem to be moving away from China, both because of a Cold War, but also because of countries wanting to not be dependent geopolitically, in a geopolitical risk sense, on just having all their supplies coming from one country. Companies are wanting to diversify away. Because of both these reasons, there's a movement away from China. And the question is, can India attract some of that manufacturing onto its own shores? But this requires that the businesses outside have both perception and commitment from the Indian side that there will be ease of doing business when you come here. Acquisition of land is a very big problem actually, and if some of those key thorny issues are resolved, I think that those could be very important reforms for India to undertake.
It's true, because in the past we have just cut down the corporate tax and other things are remain as it is. So it would not attract enough tax. True, sir. In your book, sir, you have mentioned that authorities need to acknowledge the fact that banking sector problems are not different or separate from the fiscal stress India is facing. Do you think this ignorance reflects in our monetary and fiscal policies? If yes, what can be done about it?
Yes, Sanath. I would say it's not ignored, but what happens is fiscal dominance, which is that the government, rather than addressing its own borrowing and deficits, it turns to the central bank and says, why don't we dilute the rules? Why don't we restructure certain packages for corporates without actually recognizing the losses? Let's keep the recapitalization bill of the public sector banks low. And nevertheless, yet, even though they may be not be adequately capitalized, let's get them to lend to the economy. True. So what that creates is that because one aspect is not adjusting at all, which is the fiscal side, to recognize that some of the expenditures need to be budgeted for and spent, rather than just be kicked down the road, kicking the can down the road, as they say. Because not capitalizing public sector banks is essentially tantamount to doing that. It's basically not addressing the problem head on. It's saying, let me just tide over my current budget. We will worry about this down the line. But what happens is along the way, there are significant costs because undercapitalized banks become very risk averse to undertaking fresh lending. So they increase their margins. They don't lend to the healthy borrowers at reasonable costs. And worse, they are so focused on their legacy problems. They don't want to mark their books for further losses. So they end up doing what is called as zombie lending or evergreening of bad loans. So credit, rather than going to the healthy, productive parts of the economy, instead goes to the less productive, defaulted parts of the economy. And this misallocation of credit can result in a very low growth productivity trap. So I would say it's not that we are not aware of the problem. In fact, the key question to ask is that we have gone through this cycle in the last decade. We were trying to fix it through the central bank's policies of directing the large defaulted cases to the insolvency and bankruptcy code. The question is, why did the progress stall all of a sudden? And as I explained in the introductory chapter on fiscal dominance being a theory of everything in India, I try to explain that this is because the government horizons got extremely short, and that created a pressure to open up credit and liquidity taps in the economy rather than actually continuing the path of fiscal rectitude, financial stability being anchored for 10, 20, 30 years time, and the bad loans legacy problem being resolved decisively and efficiently as the insolvency and bankruptcy code would have allowed. So I would say the problem is out there, everyone knows about it, but the system is not resisting the pressures of fiscal dominance. And in my view, the central bank, the rest of the ecosystem needs to find ways, both through open debate, use of voice, leaning against the wind, playing the game of chicken, and sometimes simply saying no, that certain things cannot be compromised upon. I think that's the way to, in some sense, throw the ball back into the court of the fiscal authorities and have them make the adjustments, so that overall we have a right balance in the economy between the government, central bank, the markets, the banks, and the private sector, because we need all of them working together so that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. The analogy I always like to give is you can't drive a car well if only the front wheels are moving.
True.
Or you can't drive a car well if only one side of the car has air in the tires
True.
and the other side is flat. It simply doesn't work.
Because we have seen the evidences from European Union where fiscal and monetary policy are two different things. European Central Bank and the PIGS crisis, Eurozone crisis that we have seen. It's a
Yeah,
beautiful.
exactly. I think Europe and Japan in the 90s and Eurozone in the last decade, they are prime examples where if you don't solve fiscal problems using fiscal arrangements, but instead you use the central bank or the financial sector to solve these problems, you might you might keep the system going on, which is that you don't risk necessarily a full-fledged crisis, but you don't recover growth either. You lose productivity, you get into a
Yes,
growth trap. The central bank gets caught in what I was calling a cul-de-sac, which is that it keeps doing more and more of accommodation. But because allocation of capital through the financial system is not improving, and you don't get the necessary fiscal measures and support being undertaken, you just don't get a vibrant growth revival that is so crucial. And see, it's even more crucial in a country like India where the population is growing very fast. We have very young population that's entering the job market every month. And our need to create jobs is far greater than that of advanced economies where per capita incomes are at much, much higher level.
see, true. Yes. So one quick question. Like recently in RBI's Monetary Policy Committee, they haven't reduced the interest rate like they have been following a tele, but now they are like having status quo. How do you see, like, are we approaching the liquidity trap of basic macroeconomics? Why it means we cannot reduce interest rate beyond a certain point?
See, certainly the interest rates are still at 4%. The repo rate is at 4%,
Yes.
and I believe the reverse repo rate is at 3.25 or 35% or something
Yes.
like that. So, why is the rate above zero? It's because our inflation is not exactly benign. Last 3 quarters have been higher than 6% inflation. If you look at the real rates, therefore, the real rates have gone negative. Now, of course, the real rates are negative in many other parts of the world also right now because of the COVID stimulus. But the inflation there, especially in developed markets, is relatively benign. It's less than
Yes.
2%. Whereas for many emerging markets, notably also for India, inflation is above 6%. And because the government's fiscal is tight, actually, as you know, the oil excise taxes are actually very large. So, in a way, you
Yes.
could allow inflation to come down by having a full pass through of the oil prices, but the fiscal doesn't allow that. And so I think the policy space is getting constrained because of a combination of inflation being high, the need for the fiscal to make corrections, which are happening unfortunately through fuel excise taxes
Yes.
rather than rationalization of expenditures and so on.
Yes.
And I would say the third point is that negative real rates with excess liquidity conditions, when credit growth is mild and banking sector, financial sector are not that well capitalized, is not a great combination, because what happens is that the savers then don't earn much on their deposits because the demand for deposits is not that high because credit is not in demand. And when deposit rates fall, the savers start looking for search for yield into other instruments. When inflation is high, we know they will start going towards gold and real estate. So right now, the real estate market is not doing as great. And so I think what we are seeing in India is that there is a chasing of equities because of interest rates being very low on fixed income securities in a
Yes.
real sense. And there is perhaps also a chasing of gold because inflation is beginning to rise again. In fact, I saw one of the mutual fund managers mention that people are actually cutting back on discretionary spending because of the lockdown, aversion to certain
Yes.
kinds of consumption because of COVID risk. And those savings are going into the equity markets.
Equity.
So negative real interest rates have a tendency to cause froth in certain kinds of risky assets. And I'm concerned that equity markets and gold may have to be watched very, very carefully so that the retail investors who are probably pumping into this. Now, of course, gold is rising internationally as well. Globally, equity markets are rising as well. Negative real interest rates are prevalent there as well. Uh, but I think, given our fiscal conditions, given our financial conditions, and given our per capita income, costs of stress and financial fragility will be felt much more in India than other places. So I think it would be prudent to be extra careful and not overly lean on the monetary
Mon.
levers.
Yes.
And by not doing that, you actually shift a little bit of the balance back onto the fiscal authorities, that you also need to make the necessary adjustments at your end.
Yes. A majority of our audience is made up of students. What are the benefits that they can expect out of your book?
Thank you, Sanat, for giving me the opportunity to answer that question. I would say three things. As you know, the book is a collection of my speeches and minutes while I was on the Monetary Policy Committee. These speeches were really my lifeblood, so to speak, as a deputy governor. They were an attempt to be an advocate for change on the important reforms that were needed for financial and macroeconomic stability. They cover a range of topics, from resolution of non-performing assets, creating a public credit registry to improve borrowing at the last mile. They talk about development of viable capital markets in India. They talk about how to improve the transmission of monetary policy. And importantly, they also talk about striking this right balance between the government, the central bank, the markets, and the private sector. So overall, I would say it is a very holistic perspective on the financial sector. The speeches are organized in themes, unlike how they came out chronologically, so that should help the reader. But most importantly, there is this introductory chapter on fiscal dominance, a theory of everything in India. My sense is it has a lot of novel insights, and it's at this in one go, it connects the macroeconomic outcomes, which are like the fiscal outcomes, to the very microeconomic outcomes, such as bank credit outcomes, market regulation outcomes, and so on. So it's a nice blend of micro and macro with a little bit for everyone to learn from. And importantly, to realize that different parts of the economy are actually working together, either in stabilizing it or destabilizing it.
Yes. Yes.
Second, the book also has a very masterful foreword by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, the former governor, of course, of the Reserve Bank of India and chairman of the 14th Finance Commission. He gives a very beautiful, very well articulated and convincing historical perspective on fiscal dominance and why the presence of public sector banks actually creates a very particular dynamic in India. He beautifully says that the government, the central bank, and the public sector banks sometimes become like a Hindu undivided family where no one keeps track of anyone's accounts. And I think there's no better way to understand the deep causes of our banking malaise than that. And third, I would say that each of my speeches was written in a particular style. Very often they started with some international evidence or evidence on India. On the topic at hand. Then it spoke about the specific context. It explained why certain policies have worked, why certain policies have not worked elsewhere. So there was an attempt to draw on the global practices. And then I would come down to some very specific recommendations. And, you have to, for a sharp message to raise a public debate, you have to make your recommendations very focused. And I think the reader may benefit from that structure because there's an overarching conceptual framework. Some data is being put on the table in most of the speeches, and then there is some drawing down on the best global practices or the literature, and then very specific Indian context recommendations are being made. I think the spirit of the book is very much to create a dialogue, to have a debate, to open up issues that are not being talked about as much, but are super important for the long run macro and financial stability. And I hope that many of you and the readers will take this unfinished agenda of restoring financial stability in India forward. I think voice is very important. It's important to have public discourse and debate. And ultimately, if the country wants change, it will have to demand the change.
True.
And then it will come through. So
Yes.
I hope you find the book engaging
Yes.
and interesting.
Yes, sir, true. I would recommend all the students and the viewers of this video that they should read the book, especially if you are preparing for a prestigious examination. It will help you in your understanding of the Indian economy better. At last, sir, if you have any final words for us, ecoholics.
Just two things, Sanat, to all of you. Learn the foundations of economics very well. Once the foundations are solid, analyzing complex problems becomes a facility. Starts coming very naturally to you. Read as much as you can, not just the classic books, but also the interesting contemporary books. And keep an open eye for good articles in newspapers and weekly digests such as The Economist. Don't just read about India. Try to also understand the rest of the world. Many economics problems are the same all over the world. They do have their own shades, but we can learn from the experiences of other countries as well. And third, I would say. Whenever you are, especially if you are doing some policy work or policy research, try and bring some facts to the table. I think it always helps if your recommendations are based on some evidence somewhere, and it's not just an assertion based on either a purely theoretical argument or something like that. Finally, I would like to wish you, your loved ones, and families all the very best in these challenging times. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, take all the due precautions. And COVID shows us more than ever that we are extremely interdependent, not just within an economy, but also across the world. And I hope that the infection curves subside soon everywhere and the global economy, not just India, can be on a path of sustained recovery very, very soon. All the very best.
Sure, sir. Same to you, your family, and you should also take care. And there must be some daylight coming very soon. And thank you so much, sir, for being a part of our show. It was a delight being able to talk to you because I'm personally a very big fan of you since your RBI days. And I would like to tell our audience that Dr. Acharya's share of proceeds from this book will all go towards Pratham India, every child in school and learning well for providing education and skilling to underprivileged children and youth in India. We are also running special offers on the book, the links to which can be found in the description. Once again, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Sanat. Take care.